All right, welcome to this explainer. Today we're putting on our serious credit analyst hats to examine a really critical warning sign in government financial health. We're talking about the revenue deficit. You know, when we evaluate state or central finances, we're constantly scanning the horizon for structural red flags. And honestly, I can tell you right now, very few flags are redder than a government borrowing money simply to fund its everyday survival. It's a massive systemic risk, and it points to some deep fiscal instability. Over the next few minutes, we're going to unpack exactly how this mechanism works, why it happens, and why it's such a heavy threat to the broader macroeconomic environment.
Okay, let's dive into this. The core mathematical identity from the textbook is actually pretty straightforward. Revenue deficit equals revenue expenditure minus revenue receipts. But what does that actually mean in the real world? Basically, it measures the exact moment when a government's day-to-day spending, we're talking routine operational costs like administrative expenses and paying employees' salaries, completely outpaces its current income, like the taxes it collects. It's a really unforgiving metric of financial imbalance. It literally tells us whether a government can even afford its own baseline existence.
So, when that revenue expenditure, those routine everyday costs, drastically outweighs the current revenue receipts coming in, we diagnose a condition called dissaving on the government account. And for a credit analyst, this is a massive flashing warning sign. Think of it kind of like a household using a high-interest credit card just to buy their weekly groceries, instead of using that credit to buy a house or a car. It's pretty clear evidence that the government is consuming well beyond its current means, and it's failing to generate enough baseline revenue just to keep the lights on.
So that brings us to a pretty pivotal question. What actually happens when governments dissave? Well, if the money coming in isn't enough to cover those daily costs going out, that financial gap doesn't just magically disappear into thin air. Oh no. The consequences shift really rapidly from being just a simple mathematical equation on a budget spreadsheet into some severe, real-world systemic risks for the entire economy.
The first major implication of this gap is what we call forced borrowing. To cover that excess expenditure, the state is literally forced to go out and borrow resources from other productive sectors of the economy. Now, what's genuinely concerning here from a credit perspective is where that money goes. This borrowed capital isn't being used to build infrastructure or hospitals or long-term assets that might actually generate future returns. Nope, it's being siphoned off solely to fund baseline consumption. The government is essentially draining vital productive capital away from the broader economy just to pay for routine present-day expenses.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because it turns into a total vicious cycle. We can map this out as the interest trap. Step 1, we've got higher borrowings just to cover the daily shortfall. Step 2, those high borrowings immediately start creating immense pressure on future revenue budgets. Why? Because they dramatically hike up interest payment liabilities. Every single dollar borrowed today for consumption means that a progressively larger chunk of tomorrow's tax revenue has to go toward paying off the interest on that debt. And that drastically limits future financial flexibility.
Which leads us directly into step 3. It creates, quote, an undue burden on the future generations who have to bear the pinch of interest burden. And honestly, this isn't just some boring accounting technicality, it's a direct, generational transfer of debt. Because remember, those funds were used entirely for consumption. Absolutely no lasting assets were created. So we're basically forcing future taxpayers to foot the bill for today's routine government spending. We're handing them all of the debt and absolutely none of the benefits.
Now, beyond that long-term debt trap, there's another, much more immediate macroeconomic danger to talk about: inflationary heat. Remember how we said these borrowed funds are being used specifically to finance government consumption? Well, pumping borrowed money directly into routine consumption injects a ton of excess liquidity into the open economy. But, and here's the kicker, it does so without creating any corresponding goods or services to match it. So when you look at the broader market, it becomes super clear. This high level of revenue deficit acts as a direct catalyst for heavy inflationary pressure. It literally makes everyday goods more expensive for everyone right now.
So if we're sitting down to issue a credit downgrade assessment based on a persistent revenue deficit, we would absolutely recap these cascading macro risks. First off, you've got the forced borrowing that drains vital resources away from other productive economic sectors. Second, you have those crippling interest payment liabilities that actively choke out future government budgets. And third, the high inflationary pressure caused by all that debt-funded consumption. When you combine them, these three factors practically guarantee a highly unstable financial trajectory for any state or central government.
At the end of the day, understanding the revenue deficit is about so much more than just balancing a ledger. It's about recognizing the very real economic pinch that households and markets are going to feel for decades to come. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.
Always keep a close eye on those underlying fiscal warning signs. Because seriously, if today's routine government consumption relies entirely on borrowed money, who exactly is going to pay the price tomorrow?